You are running a MySQL container and need to ensure the database data is persistent even if the container stops or is removed. How would you implement this, and why is it important?
Yes. First, we set up a Docker volume to store the MySQL database files. These volumes ensure data is retained outside the container's lifecycle. Then, attach the volume to the directory where MySQL stores its data, so it writes directly to the volume. To validate the data persistently, I stop and remove the container, then start a new one using the same volume. Verify that the database files and data are intact. This ensures that critical database data is preserved, even during container updates, crashes, or accidental removal.
Your team has two containers, one generating logs and another analyzing those logs. How would you set up Docker to allow both containers to access the same log data?
In this case, we use a Docker volume to hold the logs generated by the logging service. Then mount the same volume to both the log generating and log analyzing containers. Then validate that the log files created by the logging container are accessible to the analyzing container and vice versa. This setup facilitates efficient real-time log sharing and processing, essential in distributed systems for monitoring and debugging.
Can you explain what Docker volumes are and why they are important?
Docker volumes are a mechanism provided by Docker to store data outside the container's ephemeral storage layer. Containers are stateless by default, meaning any data written to a container's file system is lost once the container stops or is removed. Volumes help solve this issue by providing a persistent storage layer that can retain data beyond the container's lifecycle. Why it is important? Data persistence. Example, critical data like databases or configuration files can survive container restarts or updates. Data sharing. The volumes allow multiple containers to share data easily, which is useful in microservices architectures. Portability. Example, the volumes abstract storage details, ensuring the same data structure across development, testing, and production environments. Security. Compared to bind mounts, volumes are managed by Docker, ensuring better isolation and control.
Can you describe a real-world scenario where you used Docker volumes?
In one of my projects, I deployed a multi-container web application using Docker Compose. This setup included an nginx server, an application container, and a PostgreSQL database. The database container required persistent storage for user data and logs. For this, I created a named Docker volume specifically for the PostgreSQL container to ensure data was not lost during updates or container restarts. For Nginx, I used a separate volume to store static files that were frequently updated during development. This setup allowed us to retain critical database records even during image updates, share static assets between development and production environments, improve efficiency by mounting the same volume across containers for shared access.
How do you debug issues related to Docker volumes?
Debugging Docker volume issues involves several steps. First, we do inspect the volume. Use the Docker volume inspect command to check the volume's details, such as its mount point and associated containers. Then, verify that the volume is mounted correctly and linked to the intended container. Then check the host file system. Navigate to the volume's mount point on the host machine to ensure files are being written correctly. Look for missing or corrupted files, which could indicate issues in the container's write process. And then verify container configuration. We will ensure the container is properly configured to use the volume, as specified in the Docker run or Docker Compose file. Check for typos or mismatched paths in the configuration. Sometime we need to recreate the environment. If the volume is still not functioning correctly, back up the data, remove the volume, and recreate it. And also, check logs and permissions. Review container logs for errors related to volume mounting or access. Check and adjust permissions to ensure the container has the necessary read, write access to the volume. For example, once I found an issue where a database container couldn't access its volume due to incorrect permissions. By inspecting the volume and adjusting ownership using chown command, I was able to resolve the issue without data loss.
What's the difference between Docker volumes and bind mounts?
The difference between Docker volumes and bind mounts lies in how they are managed and their use cases. Docker volumes managed entirely by Docker. It's stored in var, lib, docker, volumes folder on the host machine. Portable, making them ideal for production environments. Secure and isolated from host directories. Bind mounts. It directly map a host file or directory to a container. It is useful for development environments where real-time updates to files are needed. This one is less secure as they give the container full access to host paths. These are the use cases using volumes for production deployments due to their portability and isolation. Use bind mounts during development when frequent changes to the file system are required.